New numbers released by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention show that America is not any closer to solving the suicide crisis. In 2018, the death rate from suicide rose once again and was one of two leading causes of death last year that saw an increase. Overall, the suicide rate has climbed 35% since 1999.
Unbelievable. Joining us now via Skype to unpack the crisis and what can be done to reverse it is Charles Lehman. He's a staff writer for the Washington Free Beacon. Great to see you, Charles.
Thanks, guys, for having me on.
Absolutely, Charles.
Can you just lay out the trend that we're seeing, what demographic groups in particular have been affected by it?
Mm-hmm. And I want to back up just a little bit. If you look at the data more or less since World War II, the suicide rate, which is the number of suicides per 100,000 people in the population, has more or less fluctuated between about 10 per 100,000 and 12 per 100,000. And then around the turn of the millennium, it started to rise linearly. And now we've hit a point where we are at the highest suicide rate. Most recent numbers are 14.2 per 100,000. We're at the highest suicide rate since essentially World War II, since essentially we got good data. There's some debate about how certain we are about that, but all the indicators say that we're seeing something unprecedented in the modern era. And then you ask about demographics. The story is complicated. You know, part of the story is that there's an increase in suicide among older, primarily rural, primarily white, primarily low education individuals. Another part of the story is that there's a surprising uptick in suicides among young people, teenagers, high schoolers, although that's, I think, a smaller portion of it. But really, you know, across the age distribution, there has been a substantial, except for really at the top of the oldest people, there has been a substantial increase in the suicide rate. So it's really a problem everywhere.
Wow. Charles, do we know about socioeconomic status and how that contributes here? Do we have any of the data indicated that? Because I think we can probably lump in suicide with the deaths of despair, opioid, drug use, meth use, all these other things into one. Do we know about like which socioeconomic groups this is largely targeting?
Mm-hmm. So we can say from death records that you are more likely to commit suicide or be exposed to suicide if you are less educated, if you have less than a college degree or less than a high school degree. That's one of the conclusions of Ann Case and Angus Deaton, the folks who came up with the concept of deaths of despair. We can also say, on the other hand, that among that group of teenagers who are dying, and this is part of why this is such a complicated problem, they are not necessarily, obviously they don't have college degrees, but they're not necessarily not college bound. For example, there's a big cluster of suicides in Palo Alto at a major high school. So I think the other thing that I think is interesting is that there is some predictability associated with marriage. So individuals who are not married or who are divorced are always substantially more likely to commit suicide, but their rate of suicide has increased faster than the married population's rate of suicide.
Wow.
And
so
Charles,
all those factors are relevant.
Is this a trend that we're seeing unfold around the world, or is this specific to us?
Interestingly, it varies. There are some countries which are experiencing heightened suicide. I can say, interestingly, within the OECD, which is the Organization of Economically Developed Nations, teen suicide is actually flat. So there is some variation. Some countries are seeing increases. Some countries are seeing decreases. I have not seen data on any country which is having that same crazy spike that I described earlier, that same just sort of linear increase from 1999 onwards.
Wow, so it's totally localized to the United States. I mean, what can we do about it, Charles? What works? You've looked at some of the programs. Has any locality successfully been able to drop their suicide rate? What are some of the pilot programs across America that might be working?
So what I actually want to say, and I've been reporting on this issue and talking to some of my sources, and they're concerned because not only is there not a consensus about what the best approaches are, and there's also not a consensus about what the underlying causes are. I talked to folks who are suicidologists, professional academic researchers, and they're concerned. I think their number one priority is just that funding for suicide prevention tools is simply insufficient. The federal government earmarks something like $70 million every year for suicide prevention. By comparison, the federal government earmarked something like $5 billion to fight the Ebola epidemic several years ago.
Oh my gosh,
and Ebola killed fewer people.
Yeah. Well, there wasn't as much of a media frenzy around this. I mean, that's really the bottom line.
Yeah.
Charles, you mentioned a cluster around one Palo Alto high school. What do we know about that? I hadn't heard about that.
This was a story a couple of years back, but it points to a bigger trend that is mostly documented in teenagers, although may or may not apply to older people, which is copycat suicides, or you get a suicide cluster where there's a group of teens, in this case at a Palo Alto high school, which is fairly high socioeconomic status. There was a spate of suicides across the high school in a period of months, I think. And part of what happens there, and may in fact be driving part of the current crisis, is that if you know somebody who has committed suicide, then you yourself are at a higher risk of committing suicide. And there's a self-reinforcing effect that means that, as suicides increase, the number of suicides increase. The risk of suicide increases.
Yeah, it's a compounding problem.
Downward spiral. Charles, thank you so much for sharing this data with us. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on.
Good to see you.
Of course.
We'll have more Rising for you right after this.